So earlier in the week, we hosted, that is to say, the Economic Society of Australia Queensland Division hosted a presentation by Andrew Hauser, the Deputy Governor of the RBA. And I served as Master of Ceremonies for that. So that meant that I had the opportunity to give a speech introducing Andrew, and I got to ask him a bunch of questions. So in the speech that I made when I was introducing him, I noted that he had said in a previous speech that the RBA, the Reserve Bank of Australia, had a different set of objectives than the Bank of England, from which he'd been previously working. And he said for the Bank of England, the primary goal is to bring inflation down to target, pretty much whatever the cost, but just bring it down to target. But he says what was different about the Reserve Bank of Australia is that there was a more balanced intention on bringing inflation down in a way that minimises the loss of employment. Well, I learned a lot from that statement because it shows you why it is that the RBA has put up rates and peaked in rates at a level which is significantly lower than the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve, because they want to preserve employment. But also why it's not moving very fast. And I said to him, at the end of his presentation, and the presentation was about decision rules and about how people looked at different ways of making decisions about interest rates. And what was most common about those ways of looking at interest rates was that they were very, very deceptive. And so I said it after his presentation when question time started. So it's really true that what the RBA does is it just operates one step at a time at every meeting. It just looks at the data for employment. It looks at the data for inflation. It looks at other information about the economy, and then it makes a decision one step at a time. There is no general rule. And he says, yes, that's exactly it. Does that mean I don't have to answer any further questions? But I did ask him a couple of more questions than that. But what I wanted to do this morning is go back to something that I've referred to before in morning meetings, and that's a simple way of thinking about how an economy is going, how the US economy is going, how the Australian economy is going, and whether or not the Fed is in a position to put up interest rates. We've heard from the RBA after their most recent meeting that in the Australian economy, demand is higher than supply, okay, and therefore they can't cut rates, and because demand is higher than supply, they've even considered putting up rates. So how do we have a simple way of looking at whether demand is higher than supply? Well, I think the simplest way of doing that, and like I said, the RBA has lots and lots of other ways, as does the Fed, is to just look at employment growth. So on the first slide, what we've got is the year-on-year rate of growth of US employment for the last 20 years. And on average, the US economy actually grows more slowly on average than the Australian economy, as you'll see in a moment. And the year-on-year employment growth for the last 20 years is 1.6%. And it so happens that after everything that's happened and all of the market volatility, that payroll growth for the most recent month in the US is 1.6%. That's exactly equal to the long term. Now, if it was growing higher than that, if it was growing more rapidly than long-term average, you could say that there was more demand in the economy than there was supply, aggregate supply, okay? And in that circumstances, if you were running with employment, well, it was rising rapidly, as it was in 22, above the long-term average, what you could say is in that circumstance, the Fed would be putting up rates, and they were. And now that growth rate has been falling, but it's not below the long-term average. So we're not in a situation yet where supply is bigger than demand. That is to say, we're just exactly balanced. And in that circumstance, the Fed is going to do absolutely nothing until employment growth falls below the long-term average. Now, what we expect, if the employment growth in the US falls below the long-term average in coming months, then the Fed will be able to cut rates, but not before, because it, like the RBA, is doing everything a step at a time, looking at inflation every time, looking at employment every time, and only then it makes its decision. Now, where are we in Australia? Let's look to the second slide on that theory. Well, like I said, the Australian economy on average grows faster than the US economy. Our average growth rate of employment for the last 20 years is 2.26%. So that's higher. That's 0.5% higher than in the US. That's a good thing. That means we're growing faster. But right now, what we see is that the average growth rate is 2.6%, which is above the long-term average. And what that says is exactly what Michelle Bullock says, is that there is more demand than supply in the Australian economy. And why is that? Well, we looked at the RBA numbers before that they published after the last meeting. Even though household consumption is only growing at 1.1%, which is pretty low, thank God the government is spending more money. And that meant that public demand is rising by 4%. And we see in Australian employment growth that Australian employment growth is above the long-term average. And where are the jobs coming from? They're coming from government spending. So what's happening is the money that Jim Chalmers is spending is putting more public servants in work. And by the way, their wages increases are higher than in the private sector. And that's generating more demand. And that's creating a situation where the RBA has to consider whether to put rates up, because unemployment is growing higher than long-term average. The RBA has to sit and decide whether they're going to put rates up or just leave them sideways. Not until you get growth in employment below the long-term average, which will be sometime next year, will the RBA be in a position to cut rates. But gee, I'm looking at forecasts put out by the RBA, and growth in government spending is continuing at the same rate in this quarter, at the end of the year, and then right into the middle of next year. So that makes it really, really hard, you see, for the RBA to cut rates before the middle of next year. And that's because demand is higher than supply, and you can see that by the fact that employment, particularly for people in government, is growing more rapidly than the long-term average.